Howdy historians, it is time to talk about trench warfare in World War One. Gross. Okay, learning goals for today are, obviously you're going to learn about the nature of trench warfare in World War One, and you're going to be able to use chronology to place events along a timeline. You're going to have a little activity where you do that one. Right, so trenches on the Western Front. Remember, in World War One, the Western Front was along the border of Germany and France, and that's mostly where we saw trench warfare. That's what we're going to be talking about today. So a trench is a long, narrow ditch, yeah, that people go in. The main fighting in World War One took place in and around the 500k of trenches of the Western Front. They went from the Belgian coast to the Swiss Alps, and I'll show you a map in a little minute so you can see what that looks like a bit more. And nobody really won in trench warfare, yeah? It was a stalemate. A stalemate is a situation where neither side can win. Trench warfare is a defensive mechanism. It's designed so that people can't get past you. And because machine guns, which were new in World War One, were so successful, it was really difficult for either side to get through the trenches of the other side, and so there wasn't really much movement that happened. The Western Front was quite stable, you know. People would lose. One side might send 10,000 people to their death to make a couple of hundred meters, and then lose it again a week later. Right, so here's an overall map of World War One, and I just want to highlight to you here where the Western Front is along here. Oh, you can't really see that. Let's do that in red. Red, I said. There. That's the Western Front there. So you got the Western Front and the Eastern Front, and then you got Gallipoli right down the bottom here. All big theatres of war. There's Gallipoli, Western Front, Eastern Front. The Eastern Front, there was a lot more movement. The Western Front was fairly static. Right, more notes. So there were many battles from 1914 to 1918, the 4 years of World War One. Sometimes many thousands of soldiers died in one day. You know, this was because they had, remember the Industrial Revolution had happened in Europe and spread around the world sort of about 50 to 100 years before this, and part of the Industrial Revolution was heaps more machines, and so industrialization affected military equipment, so the military equipment was able to kill way more people than old style arms, and you know, you can kill a lot more people with a gun than you can with a sword or a club or an axe, yeah? So some of the battles, as you see in World War One, are like thousands of people dying in one day, stuff that had never happened in human history before at all. Trenches were mostly for defense, as I mentioned. They were a defensive mechanism. You weren't planning on conquering anyone else by using trenches. It was to defend from being conquered by others. There were usually 3 trenches in a trench system. So the front line one was for attacks. This is where people might go over the top into no man's land, or you know, this is where most of the artillery attacks would happen from and to. And then the support trenches for the rest of the troops, to rest them, so you wouldn't necessarily spend your whole time in that frontline trench. You'd go in the frontline trench for a few days or whatever, and then go back to one of the support trenches, have a rest, and then go back again. And then you have reserve trenches, and that held reinforcement troops and all your supplies. So you wouldn't want to store all of your spare bombs and stuff in that frontline trench, because if someone bombed those bombs, then you would have a giant kablooey. So here's a frontline trench right here. Yeah, you can see it's a big trench dug in the ground, and there's men standing in it, pointing guns out, ready to do some shooting. That's a frontline trench. Here's some Germans in a trench. They've got these awesome spikes on the top of their helmets. As you can see, it was a little bit snowy that day, and they're having a little nap. More trenches. Yeah, this one's a bit deeper. And the soldiers on the Allied side had different hats. No pointies for those guys. Now this is fun. This is a humongous crater that was from a bomb dropped, from an artillery shell dropped in one of the battles along the Western Front. That's how big that was. And it's still there today. So this is a photo from the Australian War Memorial. This was taken during World War I. And here's a photo of that same crater today. That's in farmland in France. They are still finding unexploded bombs that got buried deep into the ground due to the war. Now, even over 100 years later, in rural France, they often, be some farmer deep ploughing a field, all of a sudden, boom! True story. Okay, your activity today is chronology. I want you to make a little timeline, your exercise book, a line with an arrow at each end, and I want you to put these in the correct order from earliest to most recent. You're possibly going to have to do a little bit of research to find out when they were, and they are when America joined the war, when the armistice was, armistice means end of the war, when Austria declared war on Serbia, hint, that was towards the start of the war, or before the war. The development of the alliances. When was the Russian Revolution? When was the sinking of the Lusitania? The Lusitania was a boat that was traveling from the US to Britain, and it was sunk by Germans, and that was one of the reasons why the US decided to join the war. They didn't want... it was supposedly a passenger ship. The Germans were pretty sure that there were actually military equipment on it, but it turns out actually we now know that there was. Anyway, a stalemate in the Western Front. So this is when trench warfare kicked in and when there was very little movement. Okay, so you're going to have to put all these things in years, and you have to put them on a timeline. So find out what year each of these things happened and put them on timelines. Some of them will have happened in the same year, so you're going to need to possibly put the month for some of them. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is another one. And the First Battle of the Marne, one of the battles with huge casualties from World War I. Okay, the video we're going to watch today is called Life in a Trench, and it's from the History Channel. Check it out.
Life in a trench, I'd like to explain in one word: horrific. It's mud, it's death, it's rats, it's stench, and soldiers develop an attitude in a trench that everybody is going to die.
Life in the trench was abysmal. There were several lines of trenches, and the front line trenches, of course, were the most dangerous because they were constantly under fire. Incoming!
The Germans dug assiduously, building dry, safe, and comfortable trenches for themselves with bunkers that actually had electricity and sometimes running water. The British and French, who were convinced that they were never going to be there for that long, didn't spend nearly the same effort. And so their trenches tended to be muddy and wet and not that safe.
Disease ran rampant. It was very difficult to get any sort of sleep, a decent hot meal, keep your clothes dry, and more importantly, to keep your sanity.
There were so many health problems of just simple disease that took much more men out of combat than direct fire.
I think one word that would surprise people about life in a trench: boredom. A lot of time is spent just sitting, cleaning tools, and being scared to death the battle's going to start any minute.
It was just the day-to-day monotony of being trapped in this very small space and fighting for a war that's really fought in inches.
The idea of open warfare, of fighting out into what they called no man's land, wasn't working. The technology of the war had advanced so much with machine guns, artillery that could lob shells a mile. It became mostly a defensive war early on, and as a defensive war, you wanted to protect your troops, so the miles and miles of trenches were built.
There were often bodies buried in the sides of trenches, bodies lying out in the open in front of the trenches. The soldiers were experiencing not only the war that they were fighting at the moment, but the war that had been going on throughout those trenches for all of the years of the war.
A young lieutenant writes his mother and says, "I haven't been killed yet, but it's only a matter of time." That's typical of the way soldiers felt about life in the trench. You just did it. You existed day to day, tried to go on, keep your chin up, but one day, the bullet was going to have your name on it, and you were going to perish. You weren't going home.
Got another cool little video here. So I was talking about how there are 3 trenches. Remember, there's the frontline trench, the support trench, and then the trench where they store all their stuff and reinforcements. And this little cross-section video should help explain that a little bit better.
Trench warfare. Trench cross-section. World War I. On the Western Front, trench systems were developed into a sophisticated network. In 1914, trenches were quickly dug out by both sides, parallel to each other, from the North Sea through Belgium and France. The trenches would offer some protection for the troops from overwhelming enemy artillery and infantry fire. Entrenching was the fast method of creating a trench system by having soldiers dig foxholes. This was dangerous, as it would be done in the line of sight of the enemy. A sapper could then transform this into a more sophisticated trench system that was deep enough for a man to safely stand up. As the war went on, the trench systems became more complex for permanent occupation. The wall facing the enemy was called a parapet, which was strengthened with sandbags to protect from enemy fire and wooden planks to strengthen the sides of the trench from collapsing in. Here there was a fire step that formed a firing position and a way for the soldier to step out onto no man's land. An ammunition shelf was also dug into the side. The wall facing the back of the trench was called the parados. Here were dugouts where the soldier could eat and sleep and seek protection from artillery bombardments. More sophisticated protection came in the form of underground bunkers, which could also be used for storage of ammunition, food, and weapons, as well as command centers for officers to communicate orders with headquarters. On the floor were duck boards to provide secure ground and aid in drainage to keep the soldiers' feet away from the water, which caused diseases such as trench foot in the muddy, soggy terrain of the Western Front. Trenches were built in zigzags instead of straight lines, so that if the enemy managed to enter it, they would not be able to shoot down them. A typical trench system was 3 lines, approximately 800 yards or 730 meters apart. The first line, that was nearest to the enemy, was the fire trench. This was the most unpleasant and dangerous place to be. They were about 8 feet or 2.4 meters deep, and 6 feet or 1.8 meters wide. The fire trench was the main line of resistance, with machine gun nests placed at strategic points and barbed wire placed in the front area known as no man's land. The sapper would also dig out a sap head, which went slightly ahead into no man's land to form a listening post. The second line was the support trench, forming the second line of defense if the first line was taken away by the enemy. A kitchen and a dressing station kept the men fed and treated for any wounds. Soldiers were rotated every week between front line and support trenches. The third line was the reserve trench. These were connected to each other through communication trenches, which were used to transport soldiers, ammunition, and food supplies, and orders from trench line to trench line. Latrines were also placed along these trenches. Behind these lines were artillery. German trench systems tended to be better overall in comparison to British trenches because of a number of reasons. One was that the British thought the trenches would only be temporary, whereas the Germans accepted that stalemate would set in and put the effort into developing better trenches, including more comfortable bunkers that were deeper into the ground, away from artillery fire. On the Western Front, the Germans were also on higher ground than the British, who were in the lowlands. This meant that the British Army would be in unpleasant terrain, with high water levels and mud. Watch our other videos to learn more. Get your copy of Simple History, World War I, available on Amazon now. Thank you guys for all your support on the Simple History YouTube channel. If you enjoy it, please consider visiting our Patreon page. There, you can show us your support for the channel by donating and make a huge difference in what we're able to create for you. Plus, you can get early access on upcoming videos. So let's keep it growing, and thank you for being part of this amazing community.
Your reflection activity today is a very quick one. I want you to simply imagine this lesson was going to be reported in the newspaper. What would you give this lesson as a headline? And it's time for everybody's favourite piece of the lesson, the homework. So I want you to answer these questions in your exercise book, and remember to include the question in the answer. Question 1, where were the trenches in World War I? So you're going to write the trenches in World War I were, say where they were. 2, what is a trench? 3, who won the trench battle? Hint, that is a trick question. For those of you who are as keen as bean machines, here's some bonus homework for you. I want you to read chapter 8.7 from the Jacaranda History Alive 9 textbook and watch this video. It's a really awesome video about trench warfare in World War I. It's from the Great War Special, and the link to it is bit.ly/trench2020. Do it if you want to. Thank you so much, and remember, always keep it real.